All right, everyone, let's get started. Oh, my bad. 1 second. So today's topic is vision and language. It comes up here. So we're going to be talking both about what are now standard multimodal tasks such as image captioning and visual question answering, as well as more recent methods towards the end of the lecture about multimodal pre-training, which are kind of the more exciting things going on in this space right now. So before we start, some logistics stuff. So next class, which is Wednesday, we're going to be doing a midterm review in this lecture slot. So I'll be here. I'll go over some things on the iPad and maybe on the slides as well. I think one point of confusion that has emerged in at least people's questions that we're getting at office hours and on Piazza and stuff is the relationship between training, test time, decoding with these language models, and how there is a discrepancy between how they're trained and how they are used at inference time. So that definitely is one thing that I'll try and highlight during the midterm review, especially how do we evaluate. There's a lot of misconceptions that we've heard so far at our office hours on why can't we use these evaluation metrics to further train our models and so on. So I think there's a lot of confusion because we split all these topics across multiple classes. So I'll just try and explain them all quickly at one shot to hopefully tie some things up. But you should come prepared with your questions. Today after class, I'll release all of the solutions for the old midterm exam, so you can, if you've tried them yourself, you can check your work there. If you haven't tried them, you can at least read over the questions and see if you can make sense of the answers. We'll go over any of those questions that you wish on Wednesday as well. So your homework 1 is due this Friday. Hopefully most or all of you have at least started collecting your data. I imagine it might be harder to find annotators as the midterm draws closer. So please finish this before you run out of time. Next week, I won't be here. Your exam is going to be released on Tuesday, and it'll be due on Thursday. So down here, we'll release it at 8 a.m. on Tuesday. It's due on Gradescope 8 a.m. on Thursday. There are no late days or anything that can be used on this exam. So you have a full 48 hours to do this. It should not take 48 hours. I know some of you may take 48 hours, but please don't. We're not trying to encourage that. We'll just release the exam as an overleaf link, and we strongly prefer if you just fill in your answers in that overleaf document and submit the PDF. But if you don't want to use LaTeX, you can, I guess, type out your answers in some other document. Last year, we also accepted handwritten answers, but there were some issues with that. So this year, no handwritten answers unless you have a very compelling reason for wanting to do that. Okay, and since we do have 2 lecture slots next week, on the Monday, if you want something to do other than studying for the midterm, we put up a pre-recorded video from last year. One of Andrew McCallum's PhD students, Lorraine, gave a great lecture on common sense reasoning. So that will not be on the midterm. None of the contents of that lecture are on the midterm. You're free to watch it whenever you want, but that's available for you to look at if you're bored of studying or something. All right, any questions on this stuff? Okay. So some of the things you can do with images and text are, okay, great. are image captioning. This is probably the first task that emerged from this like multimodal space of what can you do with both images and text. And here you're basically given an image and you're asked to produce some sort of sentence or caption that describes what's going on in that image. So here we have this picture. We might say there's a red truck parked on a street lined with trees. We can also do things like visual question answering. So given this image, we can ask questions like, does a road look new? And some model would have to process the image, process the question, and then decide yes or no, does the road look new? We can also ask more complicated kinds of questions, right? I don't know, what kind of tree is behind the truck? This is no longer a yes or no question. You actually have to look at the tree and determine, maybe your model has seen lots of different types of trees, so it can make an answer here. So this task generally is framed as a classification problem where you have, say, 1,000 different things that are common answers to these kinds of questions, and your model, given an image and a question, has to predict which of these 1,000 answers is the most appropriate. Of course, this is a very limited formulation of this task. I can't ask a question about anything that's not covered in these most frequent answers, and we might even think about extending this task to something like long-form question answering, which we saw previously, right, where your answers could be paragraphs of text long, but that has still yet to be done. So as of now, the visual QA tasks are still fairly simplistic. There are much more complicated tasks involving images and text, such as instruction following. So if you have some sort of agent in an environment and you tell it, go to the kitchen and pick up the pot or something, this agent has to turn those instructions into some sort of plan that it can follow and navigate through the environment. And all of these things, learning through interaction, a lot of that happens with an agent in some sort of environment where it gets signal, like visual signal from cameras, for example. And so this is one of the more practical or interesting, also from an algorithmic perspective, problems in this space. There's also a new line of work, newer line of work, which we won't cover here, on video understanding. So videos, obviously more complex than images. You have now this temporal component, and you also have text coming in at multiple time steps in your video, right? So you have to understand both text and image over time. Understanding long videos paired with, like dialogue from a movie or something is a very hard problem. There have been some QA data sets released that are like asking questions about what happened in a snippet from a video. So you can see where this kind of, the stuff we're going to talk about today is useful here. All right, so before we start talking about how to actually solve these things, we first have to review some basic background on what is an image, how do we represent an image, and just a very quick overview of the most popular tools that are currently used, model architectures, to get vector representations of images. So the idea is that once we have a vector of an image and a vector of some text, we all know many different ways of getting vectors of text by now, right? We can put something through BERT, we can encode something with T5, we can do whatever, right? But we need to understand how it works on the image side, and once we have two vectors, then it becomes irrelevant kind of what path we use to get those respective vectors. Now we can have some joint model that takes as input both the image and text representation and does something cool. So that's the general idea. So this might be a review for many of you, but we'll go through it anyway. So the most basic type of image, a grayscale image, is essentially just this matrix of pixels, pixel values. Each of these can go from 0 to 256, right? Nothing special. And so I just answered this question, whatever. And then, you get this kind of grayscale image. A color image is slightly more complicated. Instead of just having one matrix, you now have three. each of these contain the pixel values for one of these different channels, RGB, right, red, green, blue. This is one way of encoding an image. There are many other color spaces proposed that people use commonly for different kinds of image-based tasks, but RGB is the most popular. Right, so the lab space in particular is a useful one because it considers lightness, like luminosity, as a separate channel, essentially, which is cool. So here we're just referring to tensor as this third dimension here. So if a matrix is 2D, a tensor is anything beyond 2D, so 3D, 4D, whatever. We refer to those things as tensors, although in PyTorch, tensor basically refers to anything, so that's a little bit confusing, but it's like the default data type. All right, so the most basic thing that operation that we're going to perform over these matrices and tensors and so on is the convolution. So how many of you are familiar with convolutions? Great, so I can be quick then. Essentially, we take some very small matrix, which is called, a filter or a kernel, and we slide it over the much larger image. So here we have this 3x3 filter or kernel here. So this is the matrix. The values of this matrix can be learned or they can be fixed. But however I get the values in here, I'm just going to slide them over this image. So at this point, my kernel is centered at this slightly darker square over here. And what I'm going to do is just do an element-wise multiplication. So this cell here gets multiplied by this pixel value, this cell to this pixel value, so on. I'll just add up all the resulting products, and that final sum goes into the corresponding location of the center of the kernel in my output. And I just slide this filter across every single square in the image, pixel in the image. Of course, you have to have some special ways of dealing with what happens on the edge of the image, right, where I don't have any values over here. Maybe you have to use some padding or do something else to deal with these. But this is the very basic methodology. And so as an example here, let's say my input image is this thing, and these are the weights of my kernel. So I have a very simple binary kernel. It only has a 1 in these locations and a 0 everywhere else. So if I'm at this position of the image, what is the corresponding value that goes into this question mark? 4, right? So I have the only non-zero elements here, 1 times 3, the corresponding place in this image, and 1 times 1, I add that up and I get 4, right? Very straightforward. So despite how simple this is, it's actually very powerful in terms of the different types of properties that you can get out of an image. So here I have in this site, which is really cool, shows you what happens when you apply different kinds of filters to an image. So first of all, this is I guess the default picture here, this pixelated face. And over on the left, you can see all the values, kind of blurry, of the grayscale pixel values, the intensity of the grayness. So here, this is a sharpened kernel. So this is a fixed kernel. It's not learned. And you can see the different effect it has on different parts of the window that it's applied to. So if you're doing sharpening, you probably want whatever's in the middle of this window to have the most effect on the output. So you see that pixel's value is getting multiplied by 5 here, and everything else is kind of getting washed out, right? You even have some negative values coming in here. So if you apply this particular 3x3 kernel to this image of this guy's face, you get something that looks like this. So it has had this effect of kind of intensifying the edges and so on. You can see the actual calculations going on here. So it's pretty cool. But I can also change the type of kernel that I want. So of course, this kernel here, the identity will just copy over the original input image. Blur is interesting. So with blur, you make basically every pixel in the window have some equal-ish contribution to the output. When you apply blur, you get something like this. Right, so it's pretty cool. Like a lot of these Photoshop operations can just be implemented by very small convolutional kernels applied over the whole image. Let's see another one. Okay, not really sure what this is supposed to do, but looks cool. What is this? Okay. So anyway, you can have like drastic changes by simply changing the values of this, this kernel. And so one of the insights behind convolutional neural networks is, well, sure, I know how to get kernels to perform all of these various operations, but maybe I want to learn the values of these kernels in such a way that I can accomplish some end goal, like maybe classifying what objects are in an image or something like that, right? It's much harder for you to manually design these kernels in a way that the output will, give you something non-trivial, right? So yeah, convolutional neural networks will learn these in such a way that whatever training objective you have for these networks, that objective function is minimized by adjusting the values of these kernels. Another connection between these networks and some of the stuff that we've seen before in this class is the notion of shared weights, right? So in a recurrent neural network, for example, we use the same set of weights at every single time step of our network, right? So there's an analogy to convolutional neural networks and images, right? Because here we're using the same matrix and applying it to all of the different positions in this image, right? We're not learning a separate kernel that only operates at this position, and then this one is completely different, and this one is completely different, right? Why are we not doing that? Intuitively, why might you want to share weights between all these different positions in an image?
Trying to detect patterns in the image everywhere. We don't want anything local. We want a global pattern everywhere, like where it is present in it.
Right, exactly. So we essentially, if we have a kernel that's supposed to do something like detect edges or some like very low level functionality, we want that to be applied everywhere across the image, right? There's not just one place in the image where we expect all edges will ever be, and it's irrelevant for the rest of the image, right? If we have these position-dependent kernels, well, that doesn't even make sense, but if this were position-dependent, then we would need the model to learn this edge detector for every single position in the image, which is just a waste, right? Because if you know that you need this edge detector, then why not just share the weights and allow it to learn from every position? It's the same idea behind why we share weights in a recurrent neural network, right? Why should we treat a word at position 5 completely different than a word at position 4, right? There's a lot of information that's shared between positions in both text and image. That's why we share weights, and also minimize the number of parameters we have to learn as a result. Okay, so you can check this page out too if you have questions. Could the kernel be any shapes instead of a square? No, I don't think so. I mean, you could, I guess, artificially make it some other shape, but definitely not any common implementations of this have other shapes. Okay, and I assume you mean like a matrix and not something else. Is this similar to pooling? We'll talk about pooling in a bit, but pooling and convolution usually go together. Okay, so now let's shift away from these fixed kernels to learned kernels. So in a convolutional layer, if you come across that term, generally you have some input and you'll be applying multiple kernels. So here we have 4 different kernel or filter that are all being applied to the same input, and they produce different outputs. And then those will likely be aggregated together in some way and then fed as input to the next layer of this network. So convolutional neural networks generally stack these layers of multiple kernels at each layer, followed by some feed-forward layer or pooling layer and a nonlinearity, just like we saw in deep transformer-style networks. Actually, at this point, I should mention that nowadays, so convolutional neural networks were very popular starting around 2010 or so, and were kind of the dominant architecture and vision for the next decade. But recently, people have found that transformers can be even better than convolutional neural networks at computing image representations, which is very interesting because transformers, of course, we saw they were originally developed for machine translation, but now they're being used in every single field essentially to solve image classification. One of the things we'll discuss later in this class, the CLIP model by OpenAI, which was one of your readings, their best model actually used a transformer encoder for an image, not a convolutional neural network. So yeah, I mean, it's cool to see that this model, the transformer, has applications far beyond its intended original use case. Okay, so if we have some input image and we apply multiple filters to that image, we'll expect to have that many filters times the dimensionality of the image if we apply this layer. There are different properties of these convolutional operations. So one is the stride, which means, so what we've seen so far is with the stride of 1, where I'm shifting this window across every single pixel in the image. I don't skip any of these pixels, so every pixel gets a chance to be the center of one of these kernels, essentially. But if I wanted an output that was smaller than my input, I could apply a stride of, say, 2 or 4, which would mean every other pixel now is skipped, essentially, in this computation. So this is if, and the padding also affects the size of the output. But if the stride is 1, this is the expected dimensionality I would get. If the stride were 2, I would get this output dimensionality, right? Half of this, so I've skipped half of the pixels. And the weights here, these are 9 by 9 kernels. They could be any size, but you might want to vary the size of these as you go up or down in your network as well. So getting back to this YouTube question by Hello World Java, pooling layers are also used to reduce the dimensionality. So you might want to change the stride, but you could also apply a pooling layer. So a pooling layer basically takes the output of what you get from the convolutional layer and then does some sort of dimensionality reduction. There are multiple different methods for this. So if you imagine your input to the pooling layer looks like this, so it's this matrix down here. If I apply max pooling on regions, 2 by 2 non-overlapping regions, here I would take the max value in this top left region, which is 6, the max value in this region, which is 8, the max value which is here, which is 3, and here, which is 4, and I would get the final output just being the maximum value of all of these regions in the input. And you can see that if you increase the size of the regions you're considering, your output is going to get smaller and smaller, right? And particularly with these kinds of networks, it's important to make sure that the dimensionalities of all of these things kind of matches up to your input. You have to be very careful with padding and so on to make sure that the things line up properly. A lot of the libraries these days will take care of this for you, which is nice, but it didn't used to be like that. Okay, so question down here, why might we want to reduce the dimensionality of the representation from the preceding layer, say? What is an advantage of reducing the dimensionality in these networks? Yeah, so one reason is for efficiency, right? if we want to reduce the number of parameters in our network, maybe if we want to apply a softmax layer at the end or something like that, it's good to have as few parameters as possible so we can, fit more layers potentially into our network. There's also the, if you have a smaller dimensionality, you might encourage more salient information to get packed into that representation and more extraneous information to be lost from that representation, right? So you get this kind of effect as well, which is important with dimensionality reduction. So yeah, those are definitely the major reasons. Okay, so just a bit of history. This AlexNet paper was the very first one that started not only the computer vision revolution with CNNs, but also just deep learning in general. This was the first big convincing result that showed that these kinds of neural networks, which learn all the parameters from some training objective, in this case image classification, outperform hand-designed, feature-engineered methods of solving the same task. So, for example, when I was a grad student and I took a computer vision class, we didn't learn about any sort of neural networks at all. We learned about things like SIFT features and putting them into SVMs, and we learned about, what do you do if you have a fixed kernel, what does this kernel do, and so on, but not learning those things. These days, if you take a computer vision class, I imagine it's almost entirely based on convolutional neural networks. So how quickly things have changed. This came out, just like barely a decade ago, and has changed everything. So the task that, and I should say that this paper was made possible by the existence of a, at that time, fairly large labeled data set that people could use as a benchmark to evaluate all different types of methods, and also train some of these networks. For the first time, it was a big enough data set to actually train one of these convolutional neural networks. So the task in Imagenet, which is that data set, is given an image, classify it into one of 1,000 different categories. And the category is basically the main object of this image, what is it? So the classes are kind of strange in Imagenet. Like there's a lot of different breeds of dogs and cats that each get their own label. So you can see things as diverse as red foxes and banjos and viaducts and things like this. But overall, there's 1.2 million images, which is now not such a big data set, as we'll see later in this lecture, but back then was huge. And it's a fairly straightforward task. Given an image, pick one of 1,000 classes that it belongs to. And the AlexNet architecture was just a CNN, a convolutional neural network that had multiple layers. And then at the top, it had some fully connected layers. So these are feed-forward layers that we've seen before. And this final layer is just a softmax layer. So it's 1,000 dimensions. You get the probability of each class as the output. So, fairly similar to things that we've seen before, except with each layer is not like a self-attention type network. It's a convolutional network with multiple filters. So here at the the bottom two layers, you see we're using convolutional layers followed by pooling layers to get the dimensionality down. And once it's down to some manageable size, then we're just applying more convolutional layers. This feed-forward layer here is still quite large, and in AlexNet there were a couple feed-forward layers before the final softmax layer. But at this point, it was hard to even develop these kinds of networks. Training one of these is super expensive. We didn't have like the specialized CUDA operations that we have now to make all of this stuff fast. I think the authors of this paper even wrote their own CUDA code to make this work on like gaming GPUs at that time. Hardware has also, advanced tremendously over the past decade, which now you could probably train an AlexNet on Colab on Imagenet in like an hour or something. So that's crazy. But okay, so we have this convolutional neural network. It's learning the values of all of these kernels. What do these learned kernels actually do is another question, right? Because we saw that by just changing the values in that kernel, I could make it, sharpen something or blur something. What do these things do? And so one of the things that you see at lower layers is generally your kernels are recognizing things like edges or very basic shapes. And then as you get farther and farther up in the network, so like layer closer to the top, you might see more complex combinations of edges or like basic concepts starting to be detected and so on. So there's really, in these kinds of architectures, a clear shift between the bottom layers learn low level, like very local features like edges. The top layers learn more semantic concepts. As we'll see in NLP, when we talk about probe tasks after the midterm, this is not exactly an analogy to what happens in a model like BERT. We can't really tell if the lower layers of BERT are learning more local features than the higher level layers. But in these CNNs, they're much more interpretable and follows our intuition. I think they're even consistent with some biological explanations of how human vision processing works. Of course, BERT does not, has no analogies to how we process images in our brains. So, right, AlexNet was only 8 layers. This was in 2012. And now we have this ResNet 152 layers. I think people have gone way bigger than this since. So just like what we saw from going from like Elmo to GPT-3, the same thing has happened with these CNN architectures. And things like residual connections and layer normalization, batch normalization, these things that we saw in transformers, they're also applied to these networks, right? Residual connections were invented in the context of image classification, convolutional neural networks, and were ported over to NLP. Their first success was really in the transformer. They really weren't being used in NLP before that. I'm talking about residual connections. So the relationship between vision and NLP has been getting closer and closer since AlexNet came out. And a lot of the advances that people have made in vision for the first part of the 2010s would later, like a year or two later, get ported over to NLP. And now it seems to be going in the reverse direction, like things like transformers and all those advances are getting applied to image problems after they've originally been shown to succeed in NLP. So with scale, people have also gone beyond Imagenet finally. There was this paper in 2018 that instead of training their model on Imagenet, they trained it on Instagram, and you can get billions of images on Instagram, and people like tag these images. You can use those tags as labels and train some huge model. Of course, it's not, the data is not as clean as it is on Imagenet, but you have a lot more, like orders of magnitude more data. So we'll see later on that the OpenAI CLIP model also takes advantage of naturally occurring data on the internet to train a huge model that eclipses anything that you can do with just this Imagenet resource. But at the end of the day, for all of these tasks, and I mean, this is starting to change now, but generally we can think of a CNN or any of these CNNs or visual transformers as, at the end of the day, taking an image and giving us a vector or a set of vectors that represents that image, right? It's the same as we think of what BERT does, right? I can pass any text through BERT, look at its CLS vector, and use that as like a single vector that represents that entire text. Similarly, I can take this image and pass it through a CNN and take one of the final layer vectors as a representation for the entire image, and then put that into whatever downstream model that I want to use it in. So here, given this vector, I might feed this into a softmax layer to predict that there's a truck in this image. So of course, and this this kind of thing was basically the origin of the neural network-based transfer learning that we've seen in things like Elmo and BERT. It first happened in computer vision, and the analogous task, like pre-training task for vision, was just Imagenet classification. So this is not a self-supervised task, right? Classifying which of 1,000 categories an image belongs to, we would certainly not call this a self-supervised objective. Why not? Yeah, exactly. Like you need to have this resource of ImageNet constructed before you can even do this pre-training, right? So self-supervision, remember, refers to the fact that you just get labels for free as a byproduct of the data. So language modeling is self-supervised because we just have the next word for free, right? We don't need any additional annotation to collect the label. But here, I need someone to tell me that this image has a truck in it, right? And that's not something I can just acquire for free. A self-supervised pre-training task for images might be predict the value of the next pixel given all of these previous pixels, right? And people have looked at objective functions like this. But with images, like there's so much data available on the internet, you can get billions of images paired with things that people have written about these images, right? Captions or comments or so on, that a good pre-training task, as we'll see with CLIP, can just use these kinds of naturally occurring image text pairs rather than some purely self-supervised objective function. So let's take let's shift now to actual tasks and talk about the visual question answering task. So a very simple way to do visual question answering would be, let's first assume that you pre-trained some CNN on Imagenet. You're going to use this as your image encoder. And you pre-trained some RNN or transformer on a language modeling task or mask language modeling, and you're going to use that as your text representation model. So my CNN, I can put in an image, and I get a vector, which hopefully has all the important aspects of that image encoded somewhere in that vector. And similarly, I can take a question like, does this image have a truck in it, and encode it using my BERT or whatever, and I get a vector out of that that represents the meaning of that question. So now I have two vectors, this vector I and vector Q. And one way to do this visual question answering task, which remember, given a question, my goal is to classify the question into one of 1,000 or something possible answers that could be valid for that question. One way to do that is just concatenate my image vector and my question vector together, and then apply a softmax layer to that to predict, which one of the 1,000 answers is the correct answer for this question. So why would you say this is a bad way of doing visual question answering in particular? Yes, exactly. So this CNN and this RNN in this simple example are trained separately, right? This thing is trained on Imagenet. This thing is trained on whatever language modeling task. And they are encoding their respective inputs independently of each other. But you might imagine that if I ask you, does this image have a truck in it, a lot of the image is probably not relevant to this particular question, right? And a lot of the filters in your CNN could be fine-tuned towards something like truck detection as opposed to whatever they're generally doing, right? Maybe the behavior of that CNN should be dependent on what the question actually is, right? So in this setup, these two models are independent, and they only get fused together at the end where the computation of the actual representations of the question and the image have already finished, right? If we're freezing the weights of these individual models, then they're not interacting with each other. So if I fine-tune the two things, you might get better interaction between the image encoder and the text encoder, but there are still better ways of making them more connected. You can implement a CNN as a fully connected network. So, okay, seems more like a comment. So going back to this, a better way of fusing the image and the text together are, one thing is to do is that you can just apply attention over the image where the attention values are conditioned on the text. So if I have this image and a question, how many benches are shown? Naive way would just be to encode both of these independently and then pass them to a softmax layer. But I could compute a representation of this question and then use it to mask out parts of the image that I don't think are relevant to this, right? Like maybe if my CNN has some sort of bench detector, then I can apply it to all of these things and realize that, well, there are no benches there, so maybe I should just look at this part and then apply some more fine-grained, like counting type of method to determine how many benches there are. So to apply this kind of attention, first I would encode my question into a vector, maybe using BERT, and I take the CLS vector, and let's say that's this vector down here. Now, one way I can do this is to divide my image into some different regions. So here I have this 4x6 grid, and I'm basically going to extract a vector out of each of these grids. So a CNN gives you these region-based features as well. You can extract these. And if I do this, then I can simply compute, like a dot product between this vector and each region's representation, and use that, normalize it using the softmax, and use it as an attention distribution over the image, right? So maybe I compute, in practice, at least back when people were doing stuff like this, you might have a 14x14 grid on top of your image, so 196 boxes, and then you apply this attention over this 196 regions, and maybe the regions with a bench, ideally you would give them more attention and give the rest of the image lower attention. So, this is the same intuition that attention has for something like machine translation, right? If I'm doing attention in decoder, maybe I want the decoder to focus more on the word in the source text that has a one-to-one alignment with what I'm about to produce, or something like this. Okay, so there's also an alternative that was originally developed in image captioning called hard attention. And hard attention essentially says only one of these regions is going to be important, and all of the other regions I'm going to completely ignore. So this is equivalent to assigning only one of these boxes all of the probability and none of the other boxes get any probability at all when we're doing this kind of attention. And so here there are methods developed that use reinforcement learning to select, because now this becomes a task where you're essentially selecting one of 196 different discrete options, right? It's no longer all of these boxes are going to get some, probability mass. It's now I have 196 possible decisions that I can make. But in general, the attention over images is usually done with soft attention. It's much easier to implement and to train. It's just a standard, basically the same exact method as we've seen in attention methods in text. The only thing that differs is the source of the vectors that you're doing attention over. Okay, so we talked about visual question answering, but it was very simplistic, right? This task of determining which one of 1,000 possible answers this question. There are more interesting types of question answering settings that we're going to cover briefly now. So one is this kind of grounded question answering that actually requires reasoning over positional information of different objects in the image. So if you consider something like this, I have this synthetic image of like different basic shapes, and I have a question, is there a red shape above a circle? And the answer here is yes, and I could devise a data set of only yes/no questions that would be very hard if they were, you know, only solvable by first extracting what shapes are actually asked about in the question and then doing some reasoning over it. So this is much more complicated than, you know, tell me what kind of vehicle is in this image, right? This actually involves relationships between multiple objects within an image. These kinds of data sets, they're generally synthetic, so people can construct, you know, artificial images of these basic shapes. But more recently, there have been natural occurring images with these kinds of questions written about them, so we'll cover those as well. So the way in which these are solved is first by having different modules that basically detect different kinds of things in the image. So for example, if my question has the word circle in it, perhaps I could learn a different network, like a CNN or something, that operates over this image that serves as a circle detector or a circle localizer. So it will tell me what parts of this image have circles in it. I could similarly learn a red detector, right? What parts of this image have the color red in it? And the next step, which is not really used in the simple visual question answering thing that I talked about, is this kind of composition of these different modules, which is necessary to solve tasks like this. So if I ask you, is there a red shape above a circle, I might need to use a bunch of different basic modules and then compose them together to answer this question, right? So I might need to know first, okay, I've applied my circle detector, I've found both of the circles, now I'll apply my color detector to see what color those circles are. Now I'll apply my above detector to see what shapes are above these circles, and so on, right? So all of this is essentially like a parsing process. We haven't talked about semantic parsing yet. That's another topic to cover after the midterm, but essentially it's a way of converting a natural language utterance, like is there a red shape above a circle, to a program that can be executed over some input data. So in this case, the program could be the order of these different submodules that I'm applying to the image, right? Like, do I apply this circle detector and then apply this red detector and then apply this above detector, or what order do I apply all of these operations in? So this idea of a neural module network was developed to solve these kinds of more challenging tasks that require spatial understanding and reasoning. Basically, it does what I've said, like you have one module that operates on just detecting red things, an exists module that tells you whether some statement is true or not about the image, an above module that returns, ideally, it would return whatever shape is above an image. And all of these things get put into some sort of ordered tree and executed according to that tree to give you the final answer. And this part of like the order, the sequencing of all of these modules, it can be learned, which is actually fairly difficult. You might have used reinforcement learning to do this. Or it can be derived from applying some sort of parser to the input question. So regretfully, we have spent zero time in this class talking about basic things like constituency parsing or dependency parsing, which if we had, you would clearly understand how that worked. Maybe we will in the future, but if you want to, you can, if you want to learn about that, you can put a comment in the anonymous form. But basically, it gives you kind of a syntactic representation of, you know, what is the subject of the sentence, what are its modifiers, and so on. And you can imagine how to turn that kind of representation into one of these parses that tells you how to apply your modules. Yeah.
So how do we determine what? So do we predetermine all this for you?
Yeah. So the question is, do we predetermine all of the modules beforehand? In these kinds of networks, yeah, there is this kind of prior knowledge about your task that is encoded into the choice of modules that are actually put into the final model.
And so for training something like this,
Yeah.
is there supervision based on each of the individual modules?
Yes, so for training, one easy way you could consider doing this is, let's say I want to train this red detector, right? It's very easy for me in the synthetic environment to get supervision for the red detector, so I can train it separately from all the other things. And once I pre-train all the modules, the next step is to decide how they can all work together to answer a particular question. Okay. So this is just, one possible more complex QA task that people have done involving images and questions, text. This data set, NLVR, Natural Language for Visual Reasoning, has similar reasoning required to solve the question, but we are now not looking at synthetic images, we're looking at actual real images. So this data set consists of pairs of images. Here on the left, we see these two dogs, and on the right, we see this one dog. And the data set is just a bunch of true or false statements. The left image contains twice the number of dogs of the right image, and at least 2 dogs in total are standing. So first of all, there are 2 different statements here that both have to be true in order for this full thing to be true. And you can see that the first part, the left image contains twice the number of dogs as the right image. That requires some sort of reasoning, right? You have to basically have a dog detector, count up the number of dog detections in this image and this image, and then apply some kind of reasoning-based method to solve this. This data set is extremely difficult. But the standard approach of I'm going to have some Imagenet CNN embed this image, and then have some question-based processing of all of these things doesn't work on this kind of task. And really, the only thing that started pushing the numbers forward on this data set were these multimodal pre-trained models that we'll talk about later on in the lecture. So it was, a very challenging data set for quite a while. Back when I just first started at UMass, I used to have a lot of master's students who wanted to work with me. I guess I still do, but one thing that I did to cut down on this horde of students was basically say, oh yeah, I have an open project. Why don't you try and get above random accuracy on this NLVR data set using a method of your choice? And no one came back. So it was effective for its time, but now no longer. It's probably easy to just pull some model off Hugging Face and get a pretty decent accuracy. Okay, the questions for NLVR2 seem a little bit contrived. Is there a reason to do true and false? That's true. I mean, this question is not anything like a natural question someone would ask about a pair of 2 images, right? Because it's obvious for a human that, yes, there are 2 dogs here and 1 dog here. No one would ever ask if there's twice the number of dogs in one picture as another. Or maybe they would in some weird situation. But the data set was really constructed because this is a weakness of all the previous visual question answering models, is that they couldn't do even basic simple reasoning over things like number of objects in images or location of objects. Like me asking you if there's a dog above another dog or something in an image, you would be able to tell me that without even thinking. But for a CNN, it's really difficult. So yeah, these questions are contrived, but they're written in a way to challenge whatever the existing state of the art was at that time in vision and language architectures. The reason it's true and false is it makes the modeling problem easy, right? You only have 2 classes, and the understanding of the inputs is really critical to making the decision here. So as opposed to having the output being like one of 1,000 possible frequent answers, that is simpler in a way because it limits the types of questions that you can ask. Okay, so the same group that made this NLVR data set has turned to even more complicated types of setups that involve both images and text. So one of these is this kind of serial bar data set, they call it. There's basically some card game that requires instructions that people have to solve within this kind of simple game-like environment. There's someone who's a leader and someone who's a follower. the leader is giving instructions to the follower to go and, perform various tasks. And you can imagine implementing either of these sides with a model. But probably more interesting is a follower model, right? So the instructor, I think the leader here has access to a view that the follower doesn't have. And so the follower basically has to see the follower over here just has like this first person perspective. The leader may have the access to this entire map. And so performing things like pick up yellow hearts and run past me to the bush sticking out on the opposite side as 3 green stars. This is not a QA task, right? But it involves a lot of understanding of what exactly are the actions that I need to take to accomplish this goal. And you get feedback also as part of this game, right? Did you succeed with this goal or not? So the methods that you use to build these systems generally involve some sort of structured learning or a reinforcement learning. We're not going to go into all of these details. As you can see, it's fairly complicated. There's a lot of planning involved to see if your particular set of actions that you've decided on will result in you completing the goal. But at its core, the representations that are used in all of these pipelines are derived from CNNs applied to the image, the like 2D perspective, and vectors that are derived from the text that you get, the instructions that someone sends you. And you put all those into some fancy model and hope that you can get something that will eventually complete the goal. So more and more people nowadays are starting to work on these kinds of grounded tasks where you have an environment and you're trying to navigate through it or solve some goal. The group also, I think, has this data set called Touchdown, which is implemented within Google Street View. So you get some sort of instruction like, I think it's actually like find a teddy bear which is on the street corner, and they put like an actual teddy bear in the street view, and the agent is given directions on how to navigate itself to the teddy bear that are based on landmarks, like turn left at the grocery store or something like that. So we can go way beyond the simple VQA task that was originally posed in like 2015 now. A lot more cool stuff will probably follow soon. Okay, so that was visual question answering and instruction following and so on. Now we'll turn to image captioning, which is probably the first of these image text problems that people started working on. It's not particularly interesting. I think no one these days really works on image captioning anymore. It is more or less solved unless we're talking about very complicated images. But still, it's interesting to see how the architecture is developed, and you should be able to make connections between all the stuff we've learned on the text side to how these models have been trained so far. So basically, if I have some sort of image like this guy in a hat, I would pass it through some CNN, some pre-trained CNN, say, that's been trained on Imagenet. So I get, this one has a lot of layers and so on. And I would basically select one of the final layer representations, like the vector that is output from one of these feed-forward layers. In general, people would choose the layer right before the softmax layer as the representation that will be used for transfer learning to solve some other task, like image captioning. So the idea is that this image goes through all these CNN, conv layers, pooling layers, and these feed-forward layers, and at this point, the vector has a good representation of the important objects and relations between objects in the image that can be useful for image captioning. So that's a general insight. So now that we get this vector, the very basic image captioning model was a recurrent neural network. So before I go to the next slide, maybe someone can tell me how, if I have a single vector for the image, how can I train a recurrent neural network to produce a caption of this image? Like, how would I connect the image vector and the recurrent decoder together? So. Yes, exactly. So just like we saw with sequence-to-sequence models, right? I can consider this vector as the output of my encoder and use it to initialize the initial hidden state of the decoder RNN, right? So it's exactly the same as a sequence-to-sequence model, except the encoder is a CNN and not an RNN. I'm taking this vector output from the CNN and feeding it as the first hidden state to my RNN decoder. And if I have a data set of image caption pairs, I can easily train this RNN to output captions. So very straightforward. We've already seen all the technology on the RNN side that is needed to train this kind of, it's just a conditional language model. So we don't need to go through all of these things, right? If I'm doing image captioning, I could use beam search. People have shown that beam search gives you very boring captions that are maybe broadly applicable, but like one caption for this could be beach-related image or something, which is not non-specific, but certainly relates to this and a number of other types of images. So a lot of methods for doing things like injecting diversity into the outputs were tried, but nowadays we have things like top K sampling or nucleus sampling, which you can do to this RNN to get diverse captions. So here, this model generated straw hat end of sequence token. Not a great caption for here, but you could imagine with enough training data and diverse training data, you could get more specific captions. So image captioning became a thing around, like in this setup, became a thing around 2014 or 2015. And there were a lot of cases on which it succeeded, but also a lot of failures. A woman is not holding a cat in her hand in this picture. Here, some of these are more reasonable than others. Like here, I thought a person was holding a computer mouse on a desk. Person was actually holding a phone. But you can see how there's this tension between the RNN decoder and the actual content of the image, right? Because a person would be very likely to hold a computer mouse on their desk, maybe less so to hold a phone, maybe back in 2014, I don't know. So here a bird is perched on a tree branch. You know, maybe the data set had more images of birds on tree branches than spiders, and so the language model, if you just trained it independently on the caption data without any images, might be biased towards producing bird more often than spider, right? So if you have this setup where you only have the image affecting the RNN through the initial hidden state, you can get all of these kinds of errors, right? Because the language model can quickly learn to depend more on the tokens that it's produced already than on the initial hidden state. So what are some solutions to that we've already talked about? Like how could we make this RNN focus more on the image than it currently is? We could create a model that learns end to end. Sure, so maybe I could fine-tune my CNN using the signal from the captioning model. Maybe that would help. So that's definitely one thing you can do. What's another thing? Right, so I could do an attention mechanism, right? So in my decoder here, instead of just predicting the next word conditioned on the hidden state, I could do attention over some regions of this image using one of these conv layers here to get the region-based features. And then I could kind of put that in as input to the softmax layer along with my hidden state. So essentially the same intuition behind why we apply attention in sequence-to-sequence models could also be used here to make the model focus more on the images. And people actually did this. So image captioning with attention was introduced 2015, so like a year after the original captioning models were done. Basically at every time step of the decoder, you do some attention over the image, and hopefully that focuses the image representation on whatever object is currently being described in the image. So this is one of the successes of this model, and you can see on the top we're showing the soft attention. On the bottom we're showing hard attention, where it can only pick one of the regions to focus on. So when you're producing the word bird, it's putting most of its attention on the actual bird in this image. When you're producing body of water, it's focusing more on the background. There are other more compelling examples. So when you're producing this word frisbee, the model is focusing its attention on the actual frisbee object. The stop sign one was a very common example. There are a lot of stop signs in these captioning data sets, so models got very good at isolating the stop sign when it's predicting that word. But on the other hand, there are also some biases in these data sets that make these pictures a little bit misleading. So one thing is that if you have an image of a stop sign, it's almost always going to be in the center of the image. And so the model could be learning not to focus on the stop sign, but just learning to focus on the center of the image. And these results in this paper are all cherry-picked. If you actually look at the attention corresponding to different words using the model that they released, probably 80% of the time you'll be like, why is the attention over here? It should be over here. So the attention not really very interpretable with these models, even though they might seem that way. Yeah. How can this be solved with data augmentation? Oh, I see. You mean like this bias towards the center of the image. Yeah. So you could, for example, if you augment your data and crop it and make it off-centered and stuff, potentially prevent the model from learning this particular location bias. But there are many other ones that are not so straightforward. Like that problem was not even known before people spent some time digging into these outputs and understanding them better. So, yeah. Okay, so for the last part of this lecture, I wanted to focus on joint vision and image pre-training methods that people have been using. So there were, after BERT was released, I think basically like a year after, a bunch of methods for multimodal vision and text pre-training methods that were all released within a span of like 2 months. There were like 5 different pre-trained visual BERT models released. We won't cover all of them. We'll cover this one, VilBERT, since it's like a good representative of what all the other ones are doing. Essentially, it's the same thing as BERT, like the same sort of architecture. And you see over here on the right, the language BERT. So these models are applied to image captioning data sets. So MS COCO is a very popular image captioning data set. It contains an image paired with multiple captions of that image. And so over here, this language BERT is basically going to be operating over the caption, the text of the caption. So here, man shopping for blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing is what is going on the image side of this model, because that's new, right? And so basically what happens on the image side is that you have some sort of regions that have been extracted from the image, perhaps with places where there are objects in them, so you can run an object detector over the image and isolate. At this particular region in the image, there are, I guess, apples, and here there's a man, and here there's a basket, and so on. And the pre-training task is pretty interesting. So you can mask out these various regions and then ask the model to predict a distribution over classes of what object occurs in that particular region. So an object detector, for those of you who are not familiar with it, will usually have like some thousands of different types of objects that it can recognize. And so they basically use these models as to get the supervision for training the visual part of this model. But you can see how the caption will also be useful in helping the model figure out, at this point in the image, maybe there should be some sort of food because the caption says a man is shopping for groceries or something. But basically, we're just using a masked language model, applying it to an image captioning data set. And this can be used to solve things like visual question answering. It was useful to improve performance on that NLVR paired question answering task, and so on. So there are many different methods of doing this. But one of their biggest limitations was that they needed to be supervised with labeled data. So we could only train VilBERT on paired image caption data, which meant we had to rely on these existing captioning data sets like MS COCO, which basically just had 100,000 images or so each. So not a big amount of data, even when you look at something like Imagenet, which had over 1 million images. So this is very small. It's hard to learn a good model from just that much. Although on the text side, you can use a pre-trained BERT model to initialize the language BERT side of this. So we'll switch over for the last 4 minutes to the CLIP model that was released by OpenAI. I'll answer after class, I just want to get through this. The CLIP model by OpenAI is a very simple method that uses contrastive learning on a huge data set to obtain both an image and a text encoder. So the intuition is, first, they collected, through crawling the internet, 400 million images paired with text. So these could be, you can look through HTML to see if people have used a caption or some other way of commenting on an image. And the internet has a lot of images, so they collected 400 million of these. And then they train a very simple model on top of this data. So basically, let's say I have a transformer that is representing the text part of this, and I have a CNN or a transformer that's also representing the image, and they both give me a single vector, one for the image, one for the text. We talked about this now. So I can use this kind of objective where I say, given an image, here are 500 different texts that could be paired with this image. Just tell me which of these texts is the one that actually occurred in this data set. So that's the general idea. They use a very simple contrastive loss to do this, but you can view it as a classification problem. Like, given an image, which of thousands of different texts is the one that actually occurred in this data set? And even though it's very simple, with 400 million images and very large networks, you can learn an incredibly powerful multimodal model. And so I'll skip over, I basically just described this, but the idea is that with this kind of CLIP model, you can then use this for zero-shot learning. For example, if I get an image at test time, I can create some labels that I'm interested in if I want to solve an image classification task. So for example, if I want to create a classifier to determine if there is a plane, car, dog, or bird in the image, I can just say those are the pieces of text that I've observed, and I can compute the similarity of my image vector to the representations of each of these different words, and use the one that has the highest similarity as my answer. So even though I did not train this task for image classification, I can use it in a zero-shot manner for image classification by just specifying the space of labels that I'm interested in through text. So one of the cool parts of this model is that despite the fact that they didn't train this model on Imagenet at all, right? Imagenet was that image classification data set. They instead trained it on just image caption pairs that occur on the web. They were able to basically match the performance of Imagenet models when evaluating on these Imagenet classes. So like this one is detect bananas, and an Imagenet model gets 76% at this, and this CLIP model, despite not seeing the same specific, these images have bananas in them, gets basically the same. But this CLIP model, because it's been trained on this huge amount of web data, 400 million images as opposed to like 1 million for Imagenet, it can do all sorts of other cool things. Like for sketches of bananas, a normal Imagenet model doesn't see this kind of data, and it does really poorly on sketches. But the CLIP model is very robust to this and does better. Like chopped up banana, right? This is not in a normal Imagenet model's training data set, but the CLIP model can predict these things too. So, these more cartoony images and so on, you can see the benefits of really applying the simple objective function at a huge scale to get a much more robust pre-trained model. So the future of this kind of vision NLP will probably revolve around these very simple but scaled up joint models that are using web data. And you can draw many parallels to this and things like GPT-3, right? The similar emphasis on a simple base architecture just scaled up to huge amounts of data. They can do all sorts of cool things now. So yeah, with that, I will end, and on Wednesday, we'll do our midterm review.